Patrick Alpha. Can you hear me? Bashir, can you hear me?
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be jazz. I'm watching. Daily passing. Lemon, passing a chico. I'm watching. Daily passing a chico. Mama, passing a chico. Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be jazz. I'm watching. Daily passing a chico. I'm no qua, passing a chico. One lemon, passing a chico. I'm watching. Daily passing a chico. Mama, passing a chico.
What? You see, no, they fast like that. What? Yes, yes. Are you presenting? Yes, are you presenting? Oh, yes, the chair of the party. In B105. Yes. Yeah. Don't think so. Hello, we will watch. How are you, sir?
Hi. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, look. I do. Yeah. It's science. Are you here? Yes. Yes. Sorry, I'll say that on the same thing. I think it's funny. You see something, his file is corrupt now. Yeah. Even as an email, yeah. That's man, he does have. That's man, he has flash drive now. Just put it down. You have flash drive.
Yes.
It's that important. He has flash drive, maybe one. I think we are starting by. The file is broke. He has flash drive. Maybe you can make it. It's corrupt. Just if I on it. So how are you, sir?
Thank you for yourself. Oh, Indigenous.
I said to be there. Okay, but I'll send the Yes. You'll be one. Just how you listen to why don't you just you have to stop. Otherwise, you don't. That's you. You don't reach out to this. Experimental and experimental and evaluation. Are we doing it? Yeah, I'm just going. Yeah. Victor, yeah, right? No.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah, okay.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
All right, Adiraya, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Okay, cool. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second session this afternoon on science, technology, and indigenous knowledge in Africa since the pre-colonial period. So this is part two, and I will be chairing this session. As I mentioned in the first session, I do apologize that I'm unable to join you all in person. And I really do hope that I will be able to attend next year's LSA, the 10th anniversary in person. Nevertheless, we have made a good show of ourselves. I'm organizing this these celebratory sessions in honor of Gloria Emekwali, professor at Central Connecticut University in the US. And I have the honor of organizing it with Patrick, who is in the room. So in case there is any issue with, in case there is any technical glitch from my end, Patrick automatically assumes control of this session. As I mentioned initially during the first session, this celebratory panels in honor of Gloria Emeguali, who is one of the central figures in the history of science and technology in Africa. And without question, the matriarch of the field as far as the history of science and technology in Nigeria is concerned. As I also mentioned in the first session, uh, we've had people working on the history of science and technology in Nigeria, here and there, people writing one article or the other since the 1960s and occasionally in the 1970s. However, sustained engagement with this field, broadly defined, and it includes the anthropology of science and technology as well, sustained engagement with the field only began in the 2010s. So one notable exception to that trend is Gloria Emeguali, who has been active in this field since the 1980s. So she is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but to the best of my knowledge, she is the only scholar of Nigeria that I know who has defined herself as a scholar of African science, technology, and indigenous knowledge. In other words, who has adopted those fields as an area of expertise since the 1980s and has remained consistent in that field up to the present day. It is quite unfortunate that more scholars have not been engaging with work outside of the narrow field of the history of science and technology. And this is also why we have convened this celebratory panel to celebrate over 40 years of active engagement with this field that we can still call emerging. It's still an emerging field of African studies as it appears based on the number of scholars who are engaged in research in African science and technology and the environment as their core areas of interest. Again, the speakers in our sessions are not necessarily engaging and not conducting a review of Gloria Emeguali's work, but are offering one piece of their own ongoing research uh, as a tribute to a scholar who blazed the trail in the 1980s, but also as their own way of showing what is new, what is novel, and what is cutting edge in our field. And we are excited this afternoon to have uh, three speakers, although I can only confirm that two are available. So we have Miracle Undaka of the University of Mississippi right there in the room, a brilliant emerging scholar who is doing excellent work on experimentation, experimenting animals. That's the title of his paper, Experimenting Animals and Governing Hygiene, Colonial Strategies for Epidemic Control in 1950s Eastern Nigeria, a work that I hope would also expand our knowledge of the history of science and medicine beyond the regular humans into the realms of animal research and all of that. And similarly, we have Adirayo Sanusi of Princeton, who is an anthropologist, but also with keen historical interests in the field of science, technology, medicine. Again, I'm calling, I, and she's going to be presenting on also at the intersection of food security, but also experiments to improve food varieties. So I'm looking forward to their presentations. Edima Itwen, who was supposed to be the first speaker in this session, already presented in the first session due to some personal reasons that she had. And we do not yet have Victor Olaya in the room. If he's able to join us, we'll take him. But this session is meant to end at 7 p.m. Nigerian time, which is 2 p.m. Eastern time based on my current time zone. And right now, we are about 10 minutes into the session. And because we only have two speakers, so I would suggest that each speaker presents for about 20 minutes, no more than 20 minutes, so that we can have about well, the rest of the time really for discussions, even that would extend beyond questions and engaging with the two scholarly work. I'll begin with Miracle Undoka since is listed first in the program, and then after he's done, would immediately take Aderaya's presentation, and then at the end of both presentations, we would have the questions and answers directly from the and engagement with the audience. Thank you very much. Miracle Undoka, the floor is yours. And please move closer to the microphone so that we can hear you, if it's possible. Oh yeah, the microphone is on the table.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming for this panel, and we appreciate your presence. Just as I've been introduced, my name is Miracle Undoka. Without further ado, I titled this paper Experimental Animals and Governance Hygiene because I came across an archival material, and then I was going through those archival materials, and I discovered that from the 1930s to the 1950s, there were, outbreak of different epidemics in colonial Eastern Nigeria, which includes smallpox, leprosy, yellow fever, among others. And then those materials, we are talking about how these diseases spreaded, the different regions it got to, and how colonial officials handled its contagion. So I found out that one of the strategies that were used was, before an animal is slaughtered in the abattoir, sanitary inspectors would check whether those animals were sick or healthy. And in some cases, when those animals are being slaughtered, the carcasses of those animals were being inspected to find out whether those animals were carrier of any particular disease. Having seen all of those things going on in the official correspondences in colonial Eastern Nigeria, I decided to title this paper Experimental Animals and Governing Hygiene. Next slide, please. On May 8, 1937, the senior health officer of Southern Nigeria instructed the medical officer of the region on the need for the native administrations to produce a 5-year plan that detailed the budget for training of sanitary inspectors as well as sanitary laborers. Shortly thereafter, the native administration sent lists of sanitary inspectors to sanitary schools at Umudike, Umuahia, among others. These individuals were sponsored partly by native administration and indigenous taxes. They were given specialized training aimed to facilitate a hygienic environment. This study explores sanitation, sanitary inspectors, and hygiene. It also interrogates how colonial officials interpreted hygiene as reflected in their sanitary approaches. More so, it examines racial politics in colonial public health. The study argues that colonial sanitary regulations created spatial marginalization, inequality, as well as gender disparities in the history of Nigerian public health. The study poses the following questions. What is colonial meaning of hygiene? Who were sanitary inspectors? And what duties did they perform during the period under study? How did sanitary regulation produce urban and gender inequalities? Next slide, please. Then, looking at this archival evidence, you will see how colonial officials interpreted hygiene, what they mean by hygiene, how they portrayed it, and how they followed approaches to solve the meaning of hygiene. Part of what I'm doing in this paper is to look at hygiene beyond environmental cleanliness. Because initially, before now, we used to understand hygiene as, being dirty, being filthy. But from what I uncovered from this archival material, I found out that hygiene could also be imagined. And this evidence will be supported by anthropological evidence about different interpretation of hygiene, that it can be a social construct. And in this paper, I am saying that hygiene was imagined. Colonial officials viewed living together with native, the indigenous people as unsanitary and unhygienic. Hence, they involved in spatial segregation. Huts, the individual huts were being demolished, and these people were forcefully relocated to a different site because they felt that, oh, if colonial officials will live together with these indigenous people, it's going to create overcrowding and they are unsanitary, and it's going to cause contamination and spread of diseases in European residential areas. So in this aspect, I am saying that hygiene is imagined and not really about environmental cleanliness. And then what I'm also looking at hygiene is beyond spatial segregation. I am also looking at hygiene based on how it's created inequalities, and which confirms that, oh, hygiene is indeed emerging. Please, next slide. Sanitary inspectors and their duties. In this work, I'm looking at sanitary inspectors as mobile hygiene enforcers. From colonial correspondences that I uncovered during my archival research, I found out that in each outbreak of disease, be it smallpox, yellow fever, and what have you, sanitary inspectors were being dispatched to those regions that those diseases occurred. And one of their duties is to tour the locations that diseases were founded and to give reports to sanitary superintendents who happen to be Europeans. And within the 5-year sanitary map, sanitary inspectors within the first 3 months were expected to produce regional maps. Each location that they tour, they produce the map of that region and kind of create what is called a sanitary zone to show where sanitation conditions were more terrible or fair or good. So their reports were being given to the sanitary superintendents. Again, is that sanitary inspectors ensured the removal of what is called nuisances, be it waste products around the street, market, or homes. So whatever they see as nuisance, it is their responsibility to ensure that those things are being evacuated. Sanitary inspectors, within the first 2 years of their posting, were expected to inspect houses. They are engaged in house-to-house inspections to find out places of sanitary conditions. Above all, these sanitary inspectors inspect abattoirs and animals before and after they are being slaughtered. Next slide, please. In this picture, you will see inspection of construction of an incinerator for proper waste disposal. Part of the ways that colonial officials, govern hygiene was to construct sanitary infrastructures. Which one of them was sanitary incinerator? This incinerator was used to, burn waste to avoid it being disposed in public spaces. So, and it is the responsibility of sanitary inspector to see the effective construction of this incinerator. And these incinerators were constructed by sanitary laborers. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is an inspection of construction of market stores by sanitary laborers. Part of the sanitary infrastructure that were put in place during the colonial period was sanitary stores. And in these sanitary stores, because I mentioned that the sanitary inspectors they carry out sanitary inspections on market areas to ensure that waste were disposed in appropriate places. And as part of their responsibilities, they ensure that there are market stores that are constructed so that people will have adequate infrastructures to sell their goods. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is also another picture of double meat stores. Beyond the market stores, sanitary inspectors were also interested in constructing places where meat were being sold. I found out from the official correspondences and annual reports that are uncovered from the 1930s to the 1950s that there were inspections of meat. Before meat are being sold in the markets, they are inspected whether they were fresh meat or old meat. And then the places where meat are sold, were constructed. There were different apartments for different butchers to sell their meat to ensure that there were spaces to avoid contamination. Next slide, please. Yeah, sanitary inspectors also ensured availability of latrines in homes and marketplaces. Part of what these people did were to find out if, because they were engaged in house-to-house inspection within the first 2 years of their their duties. They check if each home have public latrines. And the instructions they were given was that each home, at least that has up to 6 occupants, must have one public latrine for their use. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is another sanitary infrastructure that is showing slaughterhouse. There were construction of slaughterhouses where animals were being properly inspected before they were slaughtered. So these slaughterhouses have different arms where when animals were slaughtered, the places that blood were drained, the places that blood passes through to ensure that there were adequate sanitary measures. Please, next slide. This is another slaughter slab. The first one is a plan on the institution of slaughter slab in the marketplaces. And the second, which is the 6B, is another plan that is showing blood drying furnace. In this slab, when animals are being slaughtered, there are provisions where the blood can pass through to avoid those blood contaminating the environment and spreading diseases. So these were part of the responsibilities of sanitary inspectors during this time period under review. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. So the next thing my work talks about is the racial politics in colonial public health measures. Sanitary inspectors that we are talking about comprise of sanitary inspectors and sanitary laborers, and these were called sanitary team. Sanitary inspectors and laborers were Africans, and these Africans perform the manual responsibilities of sanitary measures, and they give report to sanitary superintendents who happen to be Europeans. So during this time period, sanitary inspectors were dispatched to different villages. Their responsibility is to tour up to 500 houses, within a week, and give reports to sanitary superintendents who visit these sanitary regions once a week. So the racial politics is that Africans performed the manual responsibilities of sanitary measures, while Europeans did the supervisory roles. Part of all the racial responsibility is that between 1930s and 1950s, sanitary inspectors were supposed to be 10 in numbers to comprise a complete sanitary team. But there was an argument that went on during this period that if sanitary inspectors and laborers are much in number, it will be difficult for them to be under European control. So they have to be reduced to 6 in number so that they will not constitute nuisance and create rebellious act against Europeans. So again, is that the Europeans were afraid that in as much as these sanitary inspectors were Africans, they shouldn't revolt against their European superintendents. Next slide, please. The main thrust of this work is on how sanitary inspectors or sanitary measures created what I call spatial and gender inequality in colonial public health. Sanitary inspectors concentrated their activities on the colonial first-class towns, which includes Onitsha, Aba district, and Aba divisions. These places that harbors commercial activities, where sanitary measures were given, more sanitary attention were given to those places, and more sanitary inspectors and laborers were posted to those places. This is a newspaper report, the Nigerian Standard, that was showing this the report about the excellent sanitary work in colonial first-class towns. In these first-class towns, they ensured most of these sanitary infrastructure that I showed were constructed in urban areas, which are colonial first-class towns. And these sanitary inspectors that were trained at Umudike and Omahia, we are classified based on their qualifications. So they have first-class sanitary inspectors. These first-class sanitary inspectors function more in first-class colonial towns, and they had second-class sanitary inspectors, third-class sanitary inspectors based on their qualifications and the regions they were posted to. So there is another newspaper article I could not put there, which is Eastern Nigerian Guardian. That is talking about protests or petition from indigenous people that we are complaining that more sanitary measures were paid to urban areas, and they have seen the excellent sanitary works that were taking place in urban areas, whereas their regional locations suffered in sanitary conditions and unfair sanitary treatment. So from these newspaper articles, I uncovered that adequate sanitary measures were given to first-class sanitary towns, and this is because of commercial interests of colonial officials, whereas the rural areas were largely neglected because perhaps those regions did not have, economic benefits to the colonial officials. So this created spatial inequality. While the urban areas enjoyed, more sanitary attention, the rural areas lagged behind. Then also, talking about the gender inequality, between 1930s and 1950s, these colonial documents, we are talking about the responsibilities of sanitary inspectors, what they should do. And I found out that in each document, there was specifications of gender. He should carry out sanitary works within Onitsha. He should also be responsible for inspection of local markets. And then because of this gender classification, I started asking, where are female sanitary inspectors and why were they not included? So I found out that in public health measures, which were made open by sanitary inspectors, there were no female sanitary inspectors during this period. All were male. And so I am arguing that the colonial sanitary measures that were put in place created both spatial inequality in terms of concentrating more attention on the urban areas and neglecting the rural areas, and also neglecting the women who were supposed to be involved in sanitary work. And part of what I really uncovered during this period is about smallpox, because I found out that the people who resisted smallpox vaccinations were more of women. The women at the site of sanitary inspectors and vaccinators, they will carry their babies and run into the bush. And I am saying that, if women were included in sanitary inspections and colonial public health, they would have been the people to carry out enlightenment to their fellow women on the need for vaccination and on the need for sanitary measures to prevent diseases. But because there was no inclusive politics in the public health measures, women did not see the need to participate in the vaccination, so they involved in vaccination resistances because no women was involved to convince them on the need to take vaccination. So part of the major thrust of this work is to argue that sanitary measures, which on a broader note, public health policies during the colonial period from 1930s to 1950, were largely concerned with spatial inequalities and gender inequality as well. Next slide, please. So for the want of time, I'm concluding this paper by looking at hygiene, how hygiene should be understood. And my paper is looking at the understanding hygiene from the lens of power. Who decides cleanliness and why? If sanitation really require cleanliness, hygiene, then it should have covered rural areas. But because of the racial politics, sanitation, we are concerned more on the areas of interest. So I am saying that sanitation is more of sanitary works was based on colonial interest and politics, and it was largely politicized. And so who decides who should get these sanitary measures were the colonial officials, and they deprived the rural areas sanitary conditions, which would have prevented the outbreak of infectious and epidemic diseases within these regions. And I am also saying that part of the conclusion is that colonial officials implemented more sanitary measures in first-class towns owing to commercial interests and their residential safety. Because from the documents I uncovered, you can see that there were special segregations mapped out as European residential areas and native residential areas. And because of the fear that living close to this native can attract diseases, they had to separate them and make sure that their houses were demolished and they were forcefully relocated. Also, what I'm concluding this research is that inadequate funding, may hindered widespread sanitary inspectors. Places where sanitary inspectors would have gotten to prevent diseases there was inadequate funding. So priorities were given to colonial first-class towns, and rural areas were deprived. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you very much, Miracle, for that presentation. It was really excellent, and you kept to time because we started around at around 12:41. You started presenting at around 12:41, so you were not short of time. Like you had enough time to go through your work. And now I'm going to invite Aderoyo Sanusi, who, as I mentioned earlier, is a PhD candidate in anthropology at Princeton. And one thing I didn't say earlier is that, okay, well, she didn't put it in her bio, but I thought it's also important to state that she's also a lawyer who engages in this kind of interdisciplinary work in a way that really, really impresses me. Since I've learned about the kinds of interests that she's had for over a couple of years. And I'm learning about this topic, feeding the nation, for the first time. So I'm really looking forward to what she would be talking about. The floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you, Damilola. I'm sending a request to share my slides. Okay, thank you.
We'll see. Do we have any other? Victor, is he with us now? Victor. Thank you. How do I pay for conference and come?
Okay, I just want to confirm that you can see
Yeah,
the
we
first
can
slide.
see it. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank Damilola and Patrick for the opportunity to present my work in this panel. I'm really excited to honor Dr. Emeagali's work. I've been following it for a long time. And yeah, just really, really excited to jump in. Okay, so my work is really informed and draws inspiration from a paper that Dr. Emeagali published with Dr. Lasisi back in the 1980s on agro-based technologies. And I really like this paper because it explores the sort of technologies that were in Nigeria at the time, like agro-based technologies that were relevant specifically to cassava. And a key takeaway from the article was that the agro-based technologies in popular use at the time by farmers and small-scale processors increased the availability of cheap staples like gari and cassava flour, also known as lafun, even as food production declined in Nigeria's oil-dependent economy. They acknowledged the existence of large-scale processing, but their paper primarily focuses on small-scale processing. And this is really important because to keep in mind, because small-scale processing of cassava is primarily what was feeding population, like the populations in the south, and also I believe in the north as well. But I'm more like familiar with what was happening in the south. And yeah, so it's just important to keep that in perspective. That in this presentation, mass production is happening at a small scale. So the production of a lot of food or a lot of cassava is happening like in small scale. And that's what's feeding a lot of people, because a lot of times people associate like mass production with large scale processing and manufacturing. So in their paper, the agro-based technologies they talk about the non-mechanized grater, the jack and screw presser, and firewood. So I found this paper really helpful for contextualizing the activities of not just what was happening among farmers and processors, but what Black African scientists were doing at IITA at the time as they worked alongside non-Black foreigners to create improved varieties or improved cassava varieties that they hope would increase the yields of cassava farmers. So in today's presentation, I'm interested in exploring this improved cassava varieties research and a lesser known research that was happening in IIT at the time called cassava-based intercropping research. And the reason why I want to talk about the cassava-based intercropping research is because Dr. Miragali pointed out in this paper that the farming that was happening at the time involved intercropping by cassava farmers.
Sure.
So intercropping is like is part of what was helping the farmers produce enough to feed the population. So shifting to this slide, picture was taken in 1970 in front of the infamous IITA sign. And I thought it was really interesting because it really shows, so you have the white researcher, scientist, director, the foreigner, and you also have a black man, and they're facing each other. And to me, it was just emblematic of how what happened at IITA resulted from contributions of multiple races and not just white people. So the primary question that I'm exploring in this presentation is, why did IIT researchers push for local adoption of improved varieties between the 1960s and 1990s, even though IIT's cassava-based intercropping research showed that vernacular growing methods of farmers also supported high yield production, and that local varieties were more economical for smaller scale farmers and artisanal processors. So IIT was formally established by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Nigerian government in 1967 during the Civil War. And even though tensions were remained high at the time, the federal government, military government in Nigeria still allotted land and institution. At the time, IITA was headed by mostly white male technocrats that would apparently correct the knowledge gap in Nigeria. And I want to emphasize again this notion of a knowledge gap, and other Black African countries through scientific improvements in food crop production. So before I jump into the different research programming that I want to talk about, I just wanted to sort of talk about how I approach looking at the archival materials. So my work is informed, or my analytical approach is informed by Jemima Pear's work, an article she published called The Racial Vernaculars of Development, A View from West Africa. And I want to draw your attention to the excerpt on the right side of the slide. I don't have enough time to read everything, but if you look at the bottom, she goes that I argue that the terminology of development thrives on the construction of a notion of fundamental African racial difference and white Western normativity, while rendering the unequal institutional and material relations of resource extraction, among other things, through terms that sediment cultural narratives of this presumed African inferiority. So while I was reading the archives, I kept this in mind that, okay, there's this presumption in agricultural development discourse programming that there's a presumption of African inferiority. And when I recognize that it's a presumption, how can I read the archives differently? So another thing that informed my approach is Dr. Hartman's concept of critical fabulations. And she basically talks about how she uses this to deconstruct fictions of history. And one thing she said in this excerpt on the right side is, by playing with and rearranging the basic elements of the story, by re-representing the sequence of events in divergent stories and from contested points of views, I have attempted to jeopardize the status of the event, displace the received or authorized account, and to imagine what might have happened or what might have been said or might have been done. And then I'm also reading along against the archival grain. So I'm attentive to this notion of presumed African inferiority and what it would mean if I think otherwise. If I think, okay, Africans are not inferior and they knew what they were doing. So agricultural development as a technocratic enterprise, the newest version began in 1969 at the Bellagio One conference in Italy. And at that conference, representatives from the foundations announced that the research activities at IITA would usher in a new era of agricultural development and focus on tropical food crops, including cassava. Again, they met in 1917. and they went into even more detail about what they plan to do. And they said that their agricultural development will involve the introduction of superior production technologies to traditional farmers as necessary for hastening the agricultural modernization of developing nations. They designated international centers like IITA as institutional innovations designed to speed national development and to serve as tools to assist the building of stronger IIT national research programs and national problem-solving capabilities. And they also announced that they will be launching the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, now known as CGIAR. In 1971, CGIAR appointed a Korean man named Sang Ki-han as the director of IIT's Root and Tuber Improvement Program. And the objective of the program was to breed improved cassava varieties, which IITA meant as higher yielding tubers that were larger in dimension and that were meant to be more resistant to cassava mosaic disease. So in this slide, I'm specifically looking at a report that Dr. Han published in 1977, right? And I want to bring your attention to this area, the breeding objectives, and even more specifically, because a lot of it is redundant from what I've already said. The bullet point number 3, in which he talks about how a characteristic of improved varieties would be improved quality in terms of high starch, both quantity and quality, low or zero cyanide, and high protein content, especially in the leaf. So the reason why I'm bringing your attention to this is because high starch content varieties are not suitable for Gari and Lafun, which is what was feeding most of the people in Nigeria, well, in the South, in Nigeria at the time. They're not suitable for Gari and Lafun because they are too watery. And okay, so I'll return to this point later. Another aspect of the report that I found interesting is how, again, reading against the archival grain, how even as they claim that Africans are traditional and they're inferior, they acknowledge that this local knowledge is actually a form of expertise, right? So here, if you look at the second to last sentence, they go, some level of resistance to cassava mosaic has been established through intelligent selection by local farmers of superior seedlings for vegetative propagation, thereby developing new cultivars, right? So they already are acknowledging that, like, farmers already had gotten to a point intelligently. So another interesting thing I found when I was reading these reports is that the IIT was also aware that their cassava breeding of improved varieties did not make economic sense for cassava farmers, right? So in this report published in 1970, after FAO representatives visited IITA, they reported that IITA recognizes that the small farmer, particularly in Africa, has few resources and little access to purchased inputs. Therefore, an objective of the research program is to try to increase productivity with a low level of cash inputs through the development of crops and cropping systems with as much disease and insect resistance as possible and with tolerance to adverse soil conditions. This is important because improved varieties required application of expensive chemical fertilizers and were much more difficult to process with existing local technologies. Again, even within that same report, they acknowledge in this section on farm implements and machinery, the objective of this program, which is the Roots and Tubers Improvement Program, is to develop low energy demanding, inexpensive, simple farm tools which reduce hardship, increase human productivity, fit into the tropical farming systems of Africa, and are within the economic range of African farmers. Now, what I thought was interesting about this is that they're saying that they want to achieve this, but this was already happening. Like the farmers already had their own tools and technologies that they were using that were within their economic range. So what game is IITA trying to play here, right? So, okay. By the 1980s, IITA researchers were getting frustrated because they noticed that the farmers were not using the improved varieties. So this is a report that was published in 1988 by Dr. Stiefel, who was who was at that time the director. So it was no longer Dr. Han. And in this excerpt, sorry, am I over time? I just want to
So
be clear. In this
please
excerpt,
go ahead.
okay. So in this excerpt, they say that the contribution of research to greater food production during the coming decade must come largely from improved varieties of crops that are well adapted to African farming conditions. However, the real benefits of improved crop varieties will only be realized when they are widely adopted and grown by farmers. Research in farming systems, therefore, must be strengthened to ensure that new technologies are relevant to and within the management capability of Africa's small-scale farmers. The central research objective of the Institute will be to increase the productivity and income of small family farms in sub-Saharan Africa. These farmers have the potential to adopt new technology and increase food production in the lowland, humid, and subhumid tropics of Africa. So they are recognizing that, okay, what we're doing is not relevant to these farmers, right? But instead of like trying to understand, like instead of showcasing what farmers are already doing as like exemplary and like, oh, maybe how can we fit in or better support what they are doing, they are still adopting this patronizing like outlook that farmers are presumably inferior, right? Um, so to understand from the farmer perspective what was happening at the time, I found this monograph that was published by an anthropologist that conducted research, field work in Oyo, in Ibarapa, Oyo, in the 1960s and between the 1960s and 1980s. And one of the really interesting things she pointed out was that the local, so Texaco variety that I'm talking about in this is actually an IIT variety. So she said the local people also came to dislike producing the Texaco variety in spite of its advantages in yield and disease resistance. The tubers were more watery than was convenient for their own processing techniques, and the large diameter of the tubers made peeling difficult. A woman could hardly hold a tuber in one hand and peel with the other. When difficulties of production and market compounded one another, they generated a non-viable situation. So in the monograph, she goes into like several like growing techniques that were happening at the grassroots at the time. But I just thought it would be much more useful and quicker to just sort of talk, like tease out the key things she highlighted and then juxtapose it to the agricultural development, like programming that many of those reports that I already talked about. And agricultural development was pushing for improved variety for all cassava processing, whereas farmers were growing for lafun and for gari and lafun, so they were using local varieties, and they deliberately chose to use local varieties, right? Agricultural development was on this like premise of, oh, chemical fertilizers are necessary, whereas what was happening at the grassroots was more of crop rotation and interplanting of legumes to boost soil fertility. Agricultural development is about monocropping. Diversification is about intercropping and monocropping, when it makes sense, right? Agricultural development is pushing for transition from small scale farming to large scale farming through intensive land use, whereas in a more diversified production system, you have a balance of intensive and extensive land use. You have mostly small scale and medium scale farming, and when necessary, limited large scale farming. For agricultural development, industrial processing is the ideal and large scale machinery. But what actually was feeding the populations at the time, the staples, right? The most affordable foods were coming from artisanal processors that are using a blend of manual methods and small to medium scale semi-mechanized tools. And then another really, really interesting thing from that monograph is, and Odongbo was introduced into the community in the 1970s. She didn't really specify how, but Odongbo is a local variety. Otherwise, she would have said it was an IIT variety. And also, my fieldwork confirmed this, like when I conducted fieldwork in Nigeria recently. But what I think is really interesting is what she said about it. It can be harvested with a good sized tubers. We're making windfall profits like they've never seen before, right? Um, so I want you to keep that in mind, because around the time that Guy was conducting our field work, like see improved
When it's anything.
varieties as relevant. IIT, some researchers at IIT were actually conducting something called cassava-based cropping systems research, right? And in this research, um, they were looking at how various farmers in southern and northern Nigeria were intercropping cassava to boost their yields, right? And I thought like this particular study that was done in Oyo is very interesting because in this study they talk about farmers that intercropped maize and cassava, and the variety that they talk about is odongbo, right? And you can see in terms of the yield. So FO means zero fertilizer, and F1 means fertilizer, and the T is the different trials. You can see that the yields are very comparable. Like it's not really significantly more of a yield when you use fertilizer or when you use the improved variety, right? Really interesting um, thing that I saw was in the 1990s, the same scholars that published this, or well, this entire anthology, this one,
Which one?
they also published this article
Promoter to families.
explaining why they felt like intercropping research didn't have more
Promoter to families.
visibility at IITA. And they explain it away as the fact that
Families.
there was a more of an emphasis on the transfer of temperate zone technology. And the reason why I want to highlight this is because a transfer of technology implies that the locals are inferior. So you need to transfer them the advanced technologies they need. But like the research on cassava intercropping shows that there was already a lot of know-how, technical know-how happening. Like farmers and processors knew what they were doing. So it just seemed like there was a bias towards pushing, like towards like forcing improved varieties and like more expensive machinery on Africans. And this is corroborated by a book that was published by Dr. Phyllis Inweke and other like researchers at IITA called The Cassava Transformation. Just in the interest of time, I just want to quickly go to a section in which he says, the greaters developed by the government agencies have achieved limited adoption because they are more expensive and not as efficient, reliable, or convenient as those developed by the village artisans. Also, the greaters developed by engineers in the government agencies have capacities far in excess of the processing needs of the smallholders. The entrepreneurs who bought the government machines have either had them modified by local artisans or abandoned them. Okay, so my reading with the initial question that I posed, which is why were they pushing for improved cassava varieties, cassava breeding, and why was that their approach instead of following what the insights they were getting from their cassava-based intercropping? And if you go back to this report that was published in the 1980s by Dr. Stifel, it reflects an
Aderoy, I'm
institutional
sorry to
bias
interrupt,
towards.
but you have just about
Oh,
3 minutes left.
okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is like the second to the last slide. Yeah. It reflects an institutional bias towards achieving a green revolution in Africa. And in this excerpt, he acknowledges that Africans' traditional agriculture is complex with many food crops grown across a wide diversity of ecologies. Um, and that farmers were successfully using shifting cultivation to restore soil fertility. But like it just seems like they were just hell bent on forcing farmers to or indoctrinating farmers to use their improved varieties. Okay, so my key takeaways are the vernacular agro-based technologies in popular use at the time, such as local varieties and processing technologies produced by blacksmiths, promoted self-sufficient production of cassava-based staples, but seemingly advanced IITA agricultural development technologies such as improved varieties and manufactured processing equipment are designed to increase the dependency of food producers in Nigeria. All right, that is it. I hope I covered everything. And yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such a comprehensive and intense presentation. And it's good to hear about this new field of research. And I am also particularly impressed with the article by Professor Megwali that you cited. As much as I actually know a lot of her work, I actually haven't read the article, so I'm now going to find it and look into it with regards to your own groundbreaking work in this field. That is it for now. Those are the two presentations that we have this afternoon. The floor is now open for questions and answers. We have one question in the chat for Miracle, and I'll take that first. Then I'll trick to take the Q&A in the considering that it's 2025 and a percentage of US population are still against. Okay, Miracle, did you get the question? Just to be sure that everyone can hear me. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Just to be sure, can you hear me?
Can hear you.
We don't have network issue now.
Yeah, they.
Okay. Okay, yeah, but
Can you hear us now? Hello,
we can hear you.
Patrick. Oh, okay. I was asking a question to. There was a question for Miracle by Gloria Megwali, which is why were women against vaccination? And she makes reference to the present day, that's 2025, and considering that, ironically, a percentage of the US population are still against vaccination. But so can you reflect on that question? Why were women against vaccination in your research? And can you try to connect that, particularly considering the fact that I believe that you also understand a bit of the US context since you're a graduate student in the US?
So thank you very much, Professor Emmanuel, for that question. The truth is, I never even reasoned it from this perspective, and now I am beginning to see reason to try to create a connect. Yes, during that time period, women resisted vaccination, not just women, but mostly women resisted vaccination because of the implication. There is this material that talks about vaccination resulting in ulcer, that the side effect of those vaccinations resulted in ulcer. And then vaccination was free of charge, but the implication of vaccination was being charged. Vaccination were given freely, but when people began to develop ulcer out of it, they were being charged conservancy fee of £3. Yeah. So people started, making that propaganda. Why is this vaccine link being given freely? Because when people develop ulcer, they are being charged for it, which is £3 conservancy fee. So now, because Prof has really broadened my perspective about it, which is close to what we are even seeing in COVID-19 vaccination, the implications of it make people to try to avoid it. And so I think there is a greater connect. It's more of the outcome of it. Also, beyond the medical aspect is the religious aspect. I came across a newspaper publication, the Nigerian Daily Times, that posed the question, is smallpox a human being? And what that newspaper was trying to portray is that people view smallpox as, a visitation from the deity. And then when somebody with smallpox dies, you are not supposed to cry where they are being buried, because it's believed that when you cry and the deity sees your tears, it's going to still visit you. And I also found out that when people thinking of the grave of smallpox patients requires extra money, because nobody agreed to involved with such enterprise. So people have to pay more to dig the grave of the disease. So the spiritual aspect of it is that it's because of people's wrongdoing. It's just a visitation. So this vaccination is not going to cure it, because you can't cure what the rot that the gods have visited on the people. So it has medical aspect of it and also religious aspect of it. Yeah, but the relation is more close to the medical aspect of it, which is implication resulting in us. I hope I completed this.
Someone has a question.
I think we have another in the room.
Patrick, please take questions in the room.
Okay, we have one questions. Okay.
All right. I want to start by celebrating Professor Gloria Emagwali. I'm a science educator, and I have exchanged emails with her severally. And I want to say, concerning the opening remark of Dr. Damilola Adebayo, that it is not only people in the area of history that works with the work that makes reference to our work. Whenever you want to do anything around culturally responsive pedagogy in STEM teaching, there is no way you will be writing the work without making reference to Emagwali directly or the chapters in book she has put together in volume, where we have authors like Gwekere in Canada and some other great enthusiasts like Jegede and so other people in the area of STEM education. I just shared one of my recent publication with Dr. Patrick in this particular culturally responsive education in STEM. Now, I was just reflecting on the first presenter, and I asked myself, from the Yoruba culture that I am used to, before in the pre-colonial era, there is always this demarcation of Ile and Oko. You will hear it in our proverbs. They will say Atokowa Balije, and so many other things about Oko. It's even derogatory to say Ara Oko. It means that before we have the encounter with the colonialist, there's actually a demarcation in terms of architecture, civilization, hygiene. And when he made his presentation, I asked myself, is it that the things he shared with us from the archival material, are they things that the colonialists actually brought directly, or we already have that structure even within our indigenous setting? The second thing I reflected on is when it was towards the end of the presentation, we got the meat of the presentation, which is about spatial and gender disparity. And I asked myself that concerning the gender disparity, concerning officers, hygiene officers, in other professions that are like white collar then, how was the gender disparity? How many, is it peculiar to hygiene officer, or the gender disparity in the first, in those times concerning white collar job available has always been there? Those are just my personal reflection. And to Dr. Adirayo Sanusi's presentation, as she was talking about the resistance to by the locals to accept some breeds, like the women, they say maybe one is too big to carry or is too small to carry and be peeling with the other hand, is also speaking to the fact that anything that will be received by people, whoever is bringing it must give reference to their own preferences according to their culture and experiences. Thank you very much. Those are my reflections. And one remark to Professor Emmanuel. Thank you for giving us so much of materials to work with, even in science education.
Do we want to get Miracle and Adraya to respond if they have any response to that specific comment?
Yeah, I will attempt the question, but I will start with the second one about gender disparity in other spheres. So when you were talking, I was reflecting on, I think it's the Thomas Politics of Within, right? Talking about women reproduction rights, all of that, how it was in context during this colonial period. So, and then I was also reflecting on the work of Lisa Lindsay working with gender. She talked about the railway in southwestern Nigeria and how women were not really involved in the major because of the nature of it. It was more of male dominated. So then it makes me remember other literatures that talked about gender. So we find out that during the colonial time, there is this ongoing conversation about continuation of patriarchal dominance from the pre-colonial time. Part of what Lisa Lindsay did in her work working with gender is to look at how the colonialists during the establishment of the railway in the 19th century continued with this patriarchal dominance. They found out that men dominated in the workspaces, in the homes, and every spheres of life. So they kind of continue from that trend. So in that line, I would agree that it's more of gender disparity, both in sanitations and in other spheres of other concepts, is a continuation of the pre-colonial trend, because most colonial officials saw how it was practiced, and they continued from that trend, thereby marginalizing women, right? So that is for the gender disparity question. I hope I did a fair justice to it. Then on the part of demarcation in civilization and hygiene in the pre-colonial times, the truth and fairness of the process, I don't know. Right? I wouldn't say for sure that there is disparity in hygiene and civilization in colonial time. But I know that maybe in Igbo society that time, because most scholars have talked about how Igbo society was communal in nature, and then how colonial officials came and brought out white-collar jobs. People now migrated to urban areas in search of white-collar jobs, creating that kind of special disparity. So I wouldn't say in terms of special disparity, there was in pre-colonial Igbo land, it was more of villagization. People largely dwell on I don't think we have this demarcation between urban and rural areas. So I wouldn't really say.
That's why I said I was speaking from the Yoruba setting. There is Oko and there is Ile before the colonial came in. You understand? Even the Oko, there are two types of Oko. We have Oko Itile. We also have Oko Egan. Oko Itile is the farm that you just plant small pepper and all of that. You could harvest. It's trekkable within 30 minutes. But Oko Egan, you can trek for 6 hours. And that's where you have the real crops. And they can stay there for months without coming. You understand what I'm saying? So and they will just do what they call ajuba. It's not the mud house. The mud house is the one at Ile. You understand? And the king stays at Ile. The Oko Egan. That's where farmers and do. So what I mean is, what I'm trying to just emphasize is that my own knowledge of Yoruba system is that it is existing. So I don't know what is obtainable at that end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Uh, okay. Adraya, please. I was going to actually ask you to
Okay.
respond.
Yeah, so thank you for engaging with my work. Um it's not just about like outsiders like articulating their preferences when they try to introduce a new technology. In this particular context, I'm also showing that what they are portraying as improved technology or an improvement is not really an improvement. Like, and even within their own scientific institutional like programming, there was already evidence that they knew that what they were doing was not an improvement, right? So that's like one of the key things. Because when you started your comment, you mentioned culturally responsive science. Like this is a case for culturally responsive science, right? Because improved varieties was not cult like culturally responsive. It was pushing dependency, right? It was completely out of touch with what the local needs were. So that's what my comment is.
I don't know if there are other questions in the room, but
We
I
have,
do have a question. Patrick, are there questions in the room?
I'm not seeing any hand here. I think we are good here. Can you check on whether we
Oh,
have?
okay, so I have a question for Adirayo, and it's pretty basic, and what might even say foundational to the work. And I'm not sure whether you answered it while you were speaking, but I'm curious to know how cassava itself was received when it was introduced within the local scene. So beyond improved varieties and how people responded to that, I'm thinking about like if we go back to the 18th and the 19th century itself, when it was first well, well, I don't know when it was first introduced. I'm just assuming that it was popularized by Afro-Brazilian returnees as well, in addition to it being a product of the Atlantic Exchange, but also popularized by Afro-Brazilian returnees. I'm curious to know how it was even received. And the reason I asked the question is because of the follow-up question, which is how something that was previously foreign can become a symbol of local culture, right? So today we have Gary, Jebu being associated with owning Gary, even owning it. And when you talk to an average person from that part of southwestern Nigeria, they tell you it's ancient, and the whole like definition around what is ancient, what is old, without realizing that it's actually something that came into their part of the country not too long ago. So the question is, how was it received at first? And then the second layer of the question is to ask you to reflect uh, as an historically inclined anthropologist on how things that were previously foreign can be adopted by a culture and honed to the point where when you tell them it wasn't previously there, they find it difficult to believe, and some even get embedded in cultural histories, in modes of life, to the point where people can see themselves living without it. And if I can abuse my role as the chair of this session by dropping a quick comment, which is to say, so for instance, there's a popular Yoruba proverb, which I used to think did not make sense until much later, which is something along the line of I'll translate it, I won't say it in Yoruba, like something like before the corn, before maize came, the chickens were eating something. Kagbado today in Konladienje, something along that line. And I used to think, what do you mean? Like, we've always had corn, we've always had maize. Like, so what do you mean before maize came? Our chicken, our hens have been eating something else. And then it dawned on me later that also maize is also a product of the Atlantic Exchange. And it goes a long way to show that Yoruba people were actually conscious of that particular specific history, that their chicken, their hens, their poultry were actually eating something else before maize came as a product of the Atlantic Exchange. But we don't have something similar for Gary. We don't have something similar for cassava. People often think as though it's always been with them. So yeah, so that's my second question plus comment aspect. But the first question, you got it right, or do you
Yeah,
want me to remind you?
yeah.
Okay.
I'm not as like deeply immersed in the history to like to answer why like Yorubas recognize maize is more of like an out, like, because you're completely right. Like when I've told people that, oh, cassava actually came from Brazil, they're like, what? Like that's not true, right? Um, but in terms of how it was received, um, it was actually it was actually received so in the west and in the east of in the south, because that's what I'm most familiar with. Cassava came in as a women's crop because at the time there was a lot of emphasis on colonial cash crop production in cocoa and oil palm, and that was dominated by men, right? So cassava was a way for women to have their own crop, like that they made money from, like, and which turned out to be the Gary trade. And like over time, as like the other cash crops declined, men began to take up more interest in growing cassava as well. But if you look at an article called yeah, yam is king and cassava is woman. Like that's like what was happening in the southeast. But in the southwest, like initially it was a woman's crop, and primarily because they were using it to make money through Gary and Laughing. In terms of why they might not, I mean, if I had to say, okay, why were they not as a lot of the processing techniques that were used at the time were similar to what they were using to process yam. So perhaps that's why there's no like consciousness as to the fact that cassava came from Brazil. I hope that answered your question, but um, wait, I can't hear you.
Yes, yes, but the second question is
Yeah,
much more important to me.
the
The second,
the one about
yeah.
okay, yeah, the one about why they don't know, or
No,
when you
no, no,
said
no.
second.
Like about asking you to reflect on
Mm,
how things that were previously foreign, in this case, food, can
mm.
become part of local culture to the point where people can no longer imagine a world without that thing. I mean, asking you to draw on your training as an anthropologist in
Mm,
essence. Yeah.
yeah. I mean that's very. I mean, because you juxtapose it to maize, and my sense is that yeah, like it's just so. When you think about what they make from me, ogi. I mean, ogi is still like eating at the grassroots. So like, I don't know if I'm not like fully understanding the question, but um,
Okay.
yeah.
So okay, the question again, if I can
Hmm.
rephrase it in a simpler
Okay.
way, is so yes, we know that cassava is foreign. We
Hmm.
know that even corn or maize is also
Hmm.
foreign as well. No, but I mean, but when we look at how Western or foreign, let's just use foreign as
Hmm.
a broad category, even though it's complex, how do these foreign things, when we reflect on how they become part of local culture and how
Hmm.
people receive them and how people cannot imagine a world without which those things existed? So on the abstract
Oh,
level now, so beyond cassava, beyond corn, like asking you to reflect on how incoming things, again, now borrowing from Avunga, incoming things
mm.
can become part of a local context, so embedded in that local context to the point where the local people, for lack of a better word, the local people cannot imagine a world without that external thing.
Okay. So one thing I can think of, and I make this point like in the footnote in my dissertation, is that the processing techniques that they came with when they returned in the 1800s were a combination of what the knowledge they took with them to Brazil, and and the processing techniques were combined with what the indigenous Indians, the Tupi speaking Indians were doing at the time. So it was a combination of the two processing techniques that were brought over. So when they came back, so my sense is, yeah, like you could say the same knowledge circulated back. So that could be part of the reason why like it's so embedded that they have, because I'm trying to compare it to maize and why Yorubas would not know that would would know that maize is foreign but not cassava is that's like what I can think of. Um, yeah.
So,
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh, Look, I think it's best. Do you have questions in the room?
Prof is trying to make a comment.
Prof is making a comment.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, actually, this is a very exciting part of the discussion, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that brings us back to theory here. Indigenous versus endogenous. Because with endogenous, you are dealing with something coming from the bowels of the earth, so to speak, you know, from within. Indigenous, I think, would leave room for that kind of situation of, you know, adoption and adaptation and so on. But where do you draw the line? I mean, it's something that we've got to theorize on. And, you know, today, the world's leader in coffee production is Brazil. But you know what? Coffee is an African crop from Ethiopia. I know the Arabs have been trying to claim it and all that, but it's really an Ethiopian crop. And the flip side of it is that Ivory Coast, I think, you know, or Ghana, you know, they switch, lead in cocoa production in the world. They are the world's largest producers, although they somehow or the other they try to make that a secret. But that is a crop which comes from Native American, Mexico and Central American expertise and so on. So we have had a switch. Coffee, Ethiopia's coffee, you know, becoming, you know, adopted by the Brazilians. So these things have happened. But what really makes it bad is when they do as if everything is coming from one way. It's not. I'm sure many people didn't know that coffee is from Ethiopia as an indigenous, naturalized, endogenous, endogenous contribution. Anyway, I just thought I should add
Wait,
that.
Professor Adebayo, I want you to, I would love to hear your perspective on, because you're also, you know, for me, I believe language is very important as well. And my Yoruba is good, but it's not deep like that, you know. So I would just really love to hear your perspective on what you think. Why Yoruba's within the Yoruba consciousness, cassava does not seem to be endogenous in any way, right?
Well, we don't have enough time for me to go into that, and obviously, you know, we can have the conversation after this session later. And the reason I say we don't have enough time is not because I'm unwilling to share, but it's because I would also like to cede the floor once again to Professor Emeguali to make some remarks as we actually close our double panels, expressing our own work as well as celebrating our scholarship. The floor is yours once again.
Okay, well, thank you very much. By the way, I think what you said about substitute, that these were substitute crops, I think that's a good point. Because it means that they were substituting for yam, the cassava for yam, as you said. Don't forget that you have sorghum, guinea corn, which would be kind of pushed in the background, and maize would probably take the place and to some extent. So there are substitutes, not and in some cases replacements. And this would be tied up with colonial policy and all sorts of stuff, the cash crop mentality. And in some cases it would work out okay, but in some other cases it would just stifle local ingenuity. But let me just say, I want to thank colleagues, extend my heartfelt gratitude to the organizers of these two panels, Dr. Adebayo and also Patrick Okpaleke, both of York University. It's really an honor. And I want to say that I am deeply grateful for the recognition. Maybe I plan to make a few comments on 3 issues because the organizers asked me to make some comments. And I thought I'd talk a little bit, very briefly though, because we have a time limit, talk a bit about the multidisciplinary nature of the field, the importance of theory, and if there's time, mention something about AI, because I think in the earlier panel, there was reference to AI, although I missed part of the presentation, but still. So I just want to say that, as we all know, and definitely Aderayo's presentation, Aderayo Sanusi's presentation has reminded us again of, multidisciplinary nature of the field. The field involves multiple disciplines, intersecting epistemic systems and intellectual strategies that necessitate this methodological pluralist approach. Unknown caller. Let me just, that's not a good time to call. And I want to say too that the accumulated knowledges about the natural world and beyond would of course be the result of empirical practices, experimentation, and so on. And I think the presenters have reminded us of that. The area of cosmology, I don't think we had any presentation really. Well, yes, we did, because in the response to the question, I think Miracle's question about the woman, I think there was reference to some of the spiritual cosmic ideas. But anyway, in the area of cosmology and in the area of traditional medicine, for example, we have models, different of interpretation, although we know that the organic holistic model would be more conducive to investigation than, say, the mechanistic one. In any case, the multidisciplinary nature of this field makes it exciting because we can link up with and embrace, engage in the work of a wide range of scholars. Are you hearing me?
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
I think so. Okay. Molecular biology, for example, agronomy, which Sanusi was basically dealing with to some extent, archaeology, archaeobotany, phytochemistry, and so on, all provide very useful information. In the field of, and I want people to know, for example, when you are talking about going back to traditional medicine, we have a lot of work done by phytochemists, such as Professor Maurice Iwu, his handbook on African medicinal plants, Giuliani et al., and of course the pioneer in the field, Abayomi Sofora, whose work, Medicinal Plants and Traditional Medicine in Africa, should be consulted by everybody. Well, these are all based on phytochemical research. And so I think what I'm basically saying here is that we have to be aware of the progress made in the sciences as well and integrate that in our overall discussion, depending on the topic, right? The bioactive compounds in African plants, for example, would be the basic phenomena involved here. Now, in terms of theory, I think we will be consuming theory. We have been consuming theory, and we have to also produce theory related to all the different issues discussed. whether it's related to the immunization issue, you know, some kind of theoretical thing here about gender, um, colonial gender tendencies and so on, and what happens in a colonial era, you know. In other words, theories which could go not only for apply not only for this region, but elsewhere. We have to be producers of theory. And I think I don't know how many people are aware of the philosophy of science and how that is also relevant to our field. It really is. Because it brings us to this question you were about, you know, okay, when do we draw the line between indigenous and so on? And that, in a way, you know, philosophy of our own philosophy of indigenous technology, for that matter, philosophy of technology, indigenous technology, and you know, these ideas would be among the important ones we would deal with. Let me conclude by saying also that AI is very significant. I'm really sorry that I missed part of the presentation this earlier, but Chat GPT and DeepSeek actually attracted my attention a few months ago, and I just completed a paper looking at those two with respect to indigenous knowledge systems. And so that I'm a bit excited about the area, but I came to some conclusion about it. The vast database available to these two, well, I can't comment about the others. It's really DeepSeek and AI and the other one that I know. Well, Jeffrey Bean, I asked DeepSeek, what do you think about Jeffrey Hinton calling you a digital bean? Do you accept that? I got a very excited response. You know, but anyway, so I don't want to, prolong the whole thing. What we have to be very careful about, though, is the inability of these digital beings to give accurate information with respect, not with respect to content. They're not bad for content, but with respect to their sources, bibliographical sources, they are very bad. 80% wrong. That's what I discovered. But anyway, I know people might be looking at the clock, right? So I don't want to I guess I'll stop at this point. We have to make sure that the data in terms of local knowledge, local indigenous knowledge would be also factored in more than it is at the present time. So let me just say thank you very much. I do appreciate the recognition.
Thank you very much for gracing our panels, and we do hope to continue this conversation in different ways. The ultimate goal really would be to produce a first script at some point in the future, but we would like to, and that would necessarily mean opening up uh, the possibility to other scholars working in that field. And more like as a last word, I'd want to reiterate for those in the audience, particularly those interested in those who teach any aspect of this broad field of study, and also for us here as well. I want to reiterate a point that I made earlier that uh, africahistory.net is actually one of the best resources out there as far as teaching this subject is concerned. Beyond history, it is useful for philosophers of science, in fact, all aspects of our work. I see sections on African mathematics, those kind of interesting subjects that would really engage students in the classroom and demonstrate practically Africa's contribution to global science and technology. And once again, we have Gloria Emekwali to thank for curating that specific resource for many years now and inviting younger scholars to even contribute to the development of that encyclopedia, if I can call it that. Thank you very much once again, Professor Gloria Emekwali, for uh, allowing us to do this in honor of your nearly 40 years of contributions to the field. And we wish you much more more productive decades in this field. And we do hope that in 10 years or even 15 years, when we are reflecting on these fields, once again, particularly as historians and also as anthropologists, to include Adebayo, we would have way more people in the room. The field would no longer be classified as emerging. I mean, it's been an emerging field for decades now. We do hope that many more people would be interested in this field and would be interested across board, from anthropology to archaeology to history, but many more people, including scientists, will be interested in the humanities and social science approach to studying Africa's contribution to global science, technology, and to the expansion of African indigenous knowledge broadly defined. Once again, we thank you to everyone in the room for staying this late. It's 7 o'clock in Lagos. So we do thank you for waiting until the very end. And once again, thank you to Patrick in the room for co-organizing this session and for attending physically. Thank you very much for all the work that you've done in the background. I think I do owe him a great deal of appreciation for maintaining correspondence with everyone and ensuring that this event is successfully organized. And again, thank you to our speakers as well for sending us your abstract and for your interest in celebrating Professor Gloria Emekwali. Have a good night, rest everyone in Lagos, and good evening and good afternoon to everyone else in other time zones.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank
Yes,
you.
bye.
Bye.
Yeah.